exploitation of labor. The well-worn path, the idea that use increases facility in prescribed tasks, becomes a justification for increasing workloads, for deepening the grooves that repetition carves into the muscular and nervous system of the worker. For Karl Marx, the powers that are lost to the worker through the imposition of factory discipline accrue to capital. Citing contemporary assessments of the need to train factory workers, and I quote, to identify themselves with the unvarying regularity of the complex automaton of the factory, Marx endorsed Friedrich Engels' assessment of that the factory enslaves the laborer by chaining him to the despotic bell that calls him from his bed, calls him from his breakfast, and calls him from his dinner. I've been following up this vein of thought by revisiting the 1960s debates occasioned by the classic essay, Time, Work, Discipline, Industrial Capitalism, of the English Marxist historian E.P. Thompson. These debates concern the extent to which the displacement of the task orientation of pre-capitalist forms of labor with the repetitive forms of discipline imposed by the clock time of the factory system, the extent to which these also applied to slave labor in the plantation system. The American historian Eugene Genovese argued in his book Roll, Jordan, Roll that it did not, that the slave was not governed by the same sort of disciplinary time as the factory worker. However much he argued plantations resembled factories in the field, Genovese also argued that as the setting of plantations remained rural and the rhythm of work followed seasonal fluctuations, it was nature and not clock time that remained the main temporal reference for slave labor. More recent work informed by the 1619 project. The 1619 project is a project that's revisiting the history of America and arguing that the foundation of slavery in 1619 has been the key historical event that has since defined the course of American history, which anyone watching the Trump elections will realize is profoundly true. More recent work informed by the 1619 project has argued that far from representing a less rigorous system of labor discipline and the disciplining of habit than the factory system, the plantation economy anticipated the Taylorist system of scientific management that was not introduced into industrial manufacture until the early 20th century. Caitlin Rosenthal, in her recent book, Accounting for Slavery, thus interprets the plantation system as itself a machinic system for the regulation of a labor force that was distinguished from the factory workforce, not just by being unfree, in contrast to the free labor of the factory system, free in the sense of being able to leave a particular employer. Slave labor distinguished from the factory workforce not just by being unfree in that sense, but also functioning for the slave owner as a capital asset. The slave owner owned the slave, and whatever the value of the slave was a value of production for the slave owner. So for the slave owner was a capital asset as well as a source of labor. These aspects of the plantation economy were reflected in a distinctive accounting system in which the slaves whose time was owned absolutely constituted the essential gear of the plantation system's machinery. They, the slaves, they were the commodity against which a plantation's output was measured and its yields calibrated in balance sheets that recorded output in aggregate terms as so much per slave owned, which was never a feature of the accounting systems of factories employing free labor. To bring habits pathways into the picture, there's another metaphor for habit that intersects with habits pathways in the development of the plantation economy and the transport infrastructures, the roads that connected plantations to one another and to their markets. It is that of the chain of habit, which, like habits pathways, has had a varied history. Associated initially with the theologian St. Augustine, The chain of habit comprised for Augustine the iron links between previous actions, forged by the force of memory that held one fast for Augustine, not in another's shackles, but in a self-imposed limitation on the capacity of the will to initiate new, freely chosen actions. But, and here I draw on Susan Zeger's work on the logistical uses of the chain gang, chains, habits, and pathways were brought into a very different, violent association with one another in the relations between the chain gang and the development of America's damaged roadway system, the deployment of and the development of America's roadways. In both the plantation system and the post-Civil War reparation of America's damaged roadway system, the deployment of forced black labor in chain gangs constituted an early form of automatism, which anticipated the disciplinary effects of the assembly line in exacting precisely coordinated labor from its members, eliminating individual differences of rhythms and capacity. The chain gang constituted an embryonic form of collective human automation, an embryonic form of the assembly line. As a vehicle for the circulation and accumulation of capital, the road consumed its slave laborers, whose bodies were used up by the collective forms of habitual toil expended on it through the chain gang. It's with considerations of this kind in mind that in his critique of Black Reason, Achillean Baby argues that the slave economy constituted the slave's body as a work substance whose value flowed from its physical energy, a value which flowed only through the repetition without cease that was imposed on the slave in being enchained to habits pathways. My next example is differently organized. So far, I've talked about habits pathways conceived on the model of roads. But habits pathways have sometimes been thought of more as streams, courses, rivers, channels, aquatic metaphors that in the late 19th century English novelist George Eliot drew on extensively in her book, The Mill on the Floss. The basis for such metaphors was derived from the reworking of the English philosopher Locke's contentions, whom I spoke about earlier, derived from the reworkings of Locke's contentions regarding the relations between habits pathways and the association of ideas by late 19th century physiological psychologists. The work of George Eliot's partner, George Henry Lewes, was particularly influential in this regard. Lewis subscribed to post-Darwinian conceptions of habit's role in the production of a second nature, in the form of an accumulating transgenerational set of capacities. But in using the pathway metaphor, Lewis also added a physiological dimension to it in his translation of those pathways into channels, courses, carved into the body's sensory and neurological structure by the force of repetition. But for Lewis, these channels carved into the body's neurological and nervous system also threatened to lead to a dead end if the automatic ease that was engendered by habits and conscious repetition was not countered by another force. Without such another force, habits pathways promised only to carve deeper and deeper channels in the body rather than freeing the person up to acquire new, free and creative acts. For this to happen, what was required was the intervention of the brain's capacity for what Lewis called mental differentiation, a capacity that would generate new capacities, which in turn, transmitted from one generation to the next via inheritance, attached habits pathways to evolutionary accounts of social and cultural change. Lewis's work was only one of many reworkings of Locke's original formulations of habits pathway in the context of the fusion of Darwin's theory of natural selection and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's account of the inheritance of acquired characteristics that proliferated in late Victorian England. The case I want to focus on briefly is that constituted by the translation of the metaphor of habits pathways into accounts not of the survival and development of the fittest, but of the survival of the unfittest, associated with the late 19th century anthropological doctrine of survivals. Proposed initially by the anthropologist Edward Bernard Tyler, this doctrine provided an account of what I call social and cultural flatlining. That is, of people who are held to be hopelessly stuck in time, endlessly failing to develop, endlessly repeating the same. Proposed initially by Tyler, then, this doctrine provided an account of social and cultural flatlining that contributed to the development of biopolitical forms of governance of indigenous peoples, particularly in Australia. It depended on an interpretation of the rituals of so-called primitive peoples as withered forms of earlier practices which, having persisted long past their use-by date, were interpreted as remnants of the past having survived into the present. And Tyler accounted for the durability of such practices in terms of their having been once established, so little disturbed that they have, in his aquatic vision of habits pathways, and I quote, kept their course from generation to generation as a stream, once settled in its bed, will flow on for ages. Such survivals, he argued, constituted streams of folly flowing from the past that had to be eliminated in order to integrate the savage into the culture of the higher races. This was not, I need to stress, because the persistence of rituals meant that the role of habit was too strong among primitive peoples. Their alleged cultural backness derived rather from their failure to follow habits pathways to their proper end, as that end was thought by certain progressive traditions of liberal thought. Their failure to translate the ease and familiarity acquired from repeated use, as Locke saw it, into a basis for new practices. The Lockean logic of habits pathways underlying such conceptions was most clearly articulated by the museum collector and archaeologist Henry Pitt Rivers. Interpreting the tools and weapons of primitive peoples as, like Tyler's, rituals, survivals of earlier forms, having failed to develop, Pitt Rivers presented his argument as an evolutionary confirmation and extension of Locke's critique of innate ideas, positing a distinction between an intellectual mind capable of reasoning upon unfamiliar occurrences and an automaton mind capable of acting intuitively in certain matters without the effort of will or consciousness. Pitt Rivers argued that these were bound to one another by an evolutionary dynamic through which the accomplishments of the intellectual mind in earlier historical periods are passed on to subsequent generations as their inheritance of automated reason. And he saw the key mechanism in this dynamic as being that of habit, through which the lessons of experience acquired by the intellectual mind in one generation are passed on to the next generation as taken for granted aptitudes, which, in accordance with the accumulative logic of habits pathways, facilitate the development of new capabilities. The biopolitical implications of this position derive from Pitt Rivers' further argument that, and I quote, the tendency to automatic action upon any given set of ideas will be in proportion to the length of time during which the ancestors of the individual have exercised their minds in those particular ideas. This was the position that Pitt Rivers accorded to the Australian Aborigine, whose persistent conservatism, Pitt Rivers argued, echoing John Stuart Mill's account of the tyranny of custom, attributed to the failure of the progressive mechanism of habit to kick in with sufficient vigor to build up an accumulated stock of what he called modified instincts. Rather, the thin layer of instincts, endlessly repeated over succeeding millennia, had acquired an unusually binding grip on Aboriginal culture and conduct, resulting in the endless repetition of the same across beliefs, practices, tools, and weapons. This conception of the Aborigines' failure to realize the self-improving potential of habits pathways contributed to the development of biopolitical programs of colonial governance in which strategies of racial elimination increasingly displaced programs of cultural improvement. Well, I hope you've got a sense from what I've said so far of both the important role that the concept of habit has played in diverse strands of Western social and political thought, and of the practical and political importance of its roles in these regards. How then to conclude? Well, I can perhaps best do so by remarking on an issue that I haven't addressed so far. For I haven't put the question that has preoccupied a good deal of the literature on habit, particularly the philosophical literature on habit, which is to ask, what is the force of habit? For I have rather sought to displace this traditional question by asking instead, how has the force attributed to habit varied in accordance with the different ways in which habit has been conceived relative to other aspects of personhood, and accordingly been in play in different strategies for governing conduct on the part of different kinds of authority? I've also focused mainly on the forms of authority that have been exercised in relation to the negative conceptions of habits pathways associated with, in Foucault's terms, disciplinary and biopolitical forms of power. I've done so in order to provide a counterpoint to an influential tradition in Western philosophy, which has endorsed positive conceptions of habits pathways, the example of which I've given from the work of Locke, interpreting these as though they mark the course through which individuals autonomously develop new capacities. This is an aspect of a range of contemporary accounts of habit which draw on the French philosophical tradition that runs from the early 19th century text of habit of Felix Raveson through Henri Bergson's Matter and Memory to the enormously influential Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. This is a tradition which offers a positive account of the so-called double law of habit, as one which converts the negativity of habits' repetitions into a positive capacity for the development of an accumulating second nature that beckons to an increasing freedom and facility, or as it is often put, grace, a term which echoes earlier Christian conceptions of habit as a pathway to grace, as a socially selective virtue cultivated by the routines of monastic life. This tradition has had an immensely powerful and productive impact on current thinking about habit. And I don't want to underestimate that, but from the perspective that I'm proposing, it has some limitations. First, each of the main representatives of this tradition, running from Raveson through to Deleuze and beyond, has sought to maintain philosophy's position as the key authority entitled to speak for and about habit by adopting a double posture in relation to the accounts of habit proposed by empirical disciplines like sociology or psychology or neurology, taking account of them, but then limiting their import so as to retain a space for the continued exercise of philosophical or spiritual forms of authority. An aspect of this argument, to come to my second point, consists in the significance accorded to moments of indetermination, in which the force of the external causes, be they anatomical, social, or psychological, which shape habit, that force is held to be temporarily suspended so that the mind, able to swivel on itself, so to speak, is free to build on its accumulated capacities to develop new ones or to take conduct in new direction. This is the significance that John Locke accorded to those moments when the mind, by, as he put it, standing still, when the mind stands still, he said, it makes itself malleable to its own reflections and is thereby freed to break from those earlier relishes of the mind which had fixed its thought in particular ways. It's free to break from these earlier relishes of the mind to develop new passions, to move in new directions. But if standing still was for Locke, and I quote him, standing still was the hinge on which the liberty of intellectual beings depended, end of quote, it was a hinge that was remarkably selective in its distribution. It was a hinge that was denied to children, idiots, savages, and the grossly illiterate. This selective distribution of the capacity to be freed from habit's repetitions, to set off on a pathway leading to the acquisition of a degree of ease and grace in an accumulating set of capacities, is a recurring trope in the literature on habit. But it's a trope, I would argue, which, far from securing a realm of freedom in which conduct is freed from direction by any authority, is one which instantiates the mechanisms of liberal government. And these, for Foucault, are mechanisms which, far from standing opposed to government as its vis-a-vis, freedom is, he says, something that has to be produced and organized as a vector for the exercise of those forms of government which work through liberal technologies of the self. As such, he argues, its distribution is always selective, secured for some at the expense of being denied to others. And it's for this reason, then, that I'm skeptical about contemporary accounts which attribute a liberating and progressive force to habit, as if this were not itself a claim to philosophy's authority over its exercise, and as if habits' positive and negative pathways could ever be so neatly disentangled or considered without regard to the ways in which its positive versions have been annexed to privileged groups, while the various categories of dominated groups have been assigned to its negative versions. By way of illustrating this, I'll finish by discussing another version of habits pathways, again an influential one, that underlying Catherine Malabou's early work. In the usual order of things, and I'm quoting, Malabou argues, lives run their course like rivers. In this, the opening of her sentence of her book, The Ontology of the Accident, Malabou alludes to those versions of habits pathways drawing on the image of waterways, like George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss that I discussed earlier. It was, however, the American pragmatist William James who most influentially likened the grooves inscribed in the body's nervous and neural systems to the courses carved by rivers. Concerned by those moments when the flow of habits pathways might be temporarily interrupted, James urged the need for habits to be jump-started in order to be put back on track. Malabou's interest, by contrast, has been with moments of interruption, which, rather than putting habit back on track, rather than leading to the resumption of the paths it had traced before, spark off new and unheralded directions for conduct. In her What Should We Do with Our Brain, Malabou locates such moments of interruption in what she variously calls the gaps, intervals, or cuts, which, according to the contemporary neurosciences, characterize the makeup of neuronal tissue as being inherently discontinuous. This is owing to the role accorded to synapses as the gaps across which neurons communicate with one another. Malabou interprets the significance of such gaps through the lens of Deleuze's account of the brain. Deleuze's account is offered in his work on cinema, in which he accounts for the brain as nothing but an interval, the work of the brain as a series of intervals, gaps between an action and a reaction. The brain as a center of indetermination between a perception which is troubling in certain respects and a hesitant action. In my mind, the distinctiveness of Malabou's argument consists in the ways in which she aestheticizes this gap, the moment of indetermination, as an opportunity for jump-starting entirely new directions of action. The brain's capacity, and I quote from her, to adapt itself, to include modifications, to receive shocks, and to create anew, is read as the manifestation as a radical plasticity that, she says, makes us, and I quote, precisely in the sense of a work, by which she means a work of art, a sculpture, a modeling, architecture. This is the conception of neuroplasticity that opens up the prospect that we might each become free and autonomous subject of our own neuronal auto-creation. If it is through repetition, and habit that specific neuronal pathways are stabilized, Malibu argues, it is by disrupting habit and repetition that we can become the authors of our neural futures and of ourselves as works of art. Plasticity, as Malibu puts it, and I'm quoting, thus adds the function of artist and instructor in freedom and autonomy to its role as sculptor. In phrasing instructor in freedom and autonomy, the phrasing instructor in freedom and autonomy nicely encapsulate the points I want to make regarding the role which Malibu accords aesthetics as a form of authority, which shapes how the opportunity for free self-shaping that is afforded by the gap in habit's pathway is to be exercised. In speaking of habit as a form of authority here, I have in mind, this is my view, it's a contentious one, but anyway, I'll elaborate. I have in mind the modus operandi of the Western tradition of philosophical aesthetics as one which has constructed the relations between the subject and artworks as a zone of freedom, in which it is, however, not a zone of entire freedom, it's a zone in which it's the philosopher aesthetician who is freedom's self-appointed guide. This has involved the organization of a range of different conceptions of the relations between aesthetics and habit, from Kant's positing them as irreconcilable opposites to G.D.H. Cole's interpretation of the aesthetic counter as a means of guiding the man to freely break his habits of drunkenness rather than compelling him to do so. The aesthetic qualities that Malibu attributes to the gaps and explosions which interrupt habit's pathway mobilize a more modernist conception of the aesthetic as the site or moment of a possible rupture, whose possibilities we might realize, provided we take the philosopher aesthetician as our guide, rather than the interpretations of the implications of neuroplasticity for how we should relate to our habits advanced by other authorities, neurologists, psychologists, sociologists. I shan't attempt here to decide between these. My point rather, and judging from her more recent book, Morphing Intelligence, in which she significantly qualifies her earlier work, it's one which I think Malibu would accept, is that it is precisely in such contestations between competing authorities as to how habit might be guarded, it's precisely in such contestations that we must look to engage with the complex pathways of habit's political history. Well, that's the end. That's quite a long talk, I appreciate. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward. I hope what I've had to say has connected in some ways with your concerns, and I look forward to your questions, responses, disagreements, dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bennett. So before we start the question and answer session, I would like to conclude your presentation, but I will explain in Bahasa Indonesia, in Indonesian, for the participants, just to give a gist of what you have discussed about. Okay. Jadi Bapak Ibu, dalam presentasi Profesor Bennett memetakan bagaimana habit pathways, terutama dalam historisitas keilmuan filsafat Barat. Profesor Bennett berargumen bahwa habit adalah konsep yang tidak stabil dan terus berubah, terutama dalam kaitannya dengan konsep-konsep lain, seperti konsep repetition atau konsep custom. Profesor Bennett menjelaskan, misalnya, habit dan repetition atau kebiasaan dan pengulangan adalah konsep yang saling terkait tapi dalam bentuk yang berbeda. Contoh lain adalah habit dan custom. Jadi misalnya dalam teologi di abad pertengahan, custom itu dibedakan dengan habit. Tetapi dalam perkembangannya, filsuf David Hume justru melihat kedua konsep ini adalah satu bagian yang menjadi pengarah dari jalur kehidupan untuk manusia. Profesor Bennett mengacu pada trajektori perkembangan pengetahuan dan perkembangan konseptualisasi mengenai habit atau kebiasaan. Salah satu konseptualisasi dasar yang Profesor Bennett bahas adalah datang dari Foucault. Ketika Foucault berbicara mengenai habit dan power atau habit dan kekuasaan. Kata kunci dalam pemikiran Foucault adalah kaitan antara habit, normalisasi, dan pendisiplinan dalam karyanya The Punitive Society. Habit menjadi pondasi terbentuknya masyarakat modern karena adanya konstruksi-konstruksi, seperti misalnya bagaimana kelas pekerja melalui normalisasi, ya. Jadi misalnya melalui sistem kerja. Jadi ketika kita harus kerja setiap hari dari jam 9 sampai jam 5, itu adalah bagian dari pembentukan masyarakat modern yang sangat terkait dengan habit, normalisasi, dan pendisiplinan. Profesor Bennett juga berdiskusi mengenai habit pathways yang sering sekali diasosiasikan dengan metafora alur atau jalan, tapi juga dimetaforakan dengan mengacu pada elemen-elemen air, seperti sungai atau aliran air apapun. Konseptualisasi ini sebenarnya mengacu pada keterhubungan ide di bidang ilmu physiological psychologist, terutama di abad 19 ketika melihat habit adalah bagian dari saluran yang terpatrik dalam sensori tubuh serta struktur neurologi manusia sebagai akibat kuatnya proses pengulangan. Jadi habit itu dilakukan bukan hanya sebagai bagian dari sosial dan budaya, tapi juga secara fisik dan secara biologis ternyata dari abad 19 dikatakan itu mempengaruhi sensori tubuh kita. Gitu. Jadi ketika kita melakukan sesuatu itu bukan lagi berdasarkan kesadaran secara psikologis, tapi juga secara fisik begitu. Jadi dalam perkembangannya, pemahaman mengenai habit pathways dan pemosisiannya dalam beberapa bidang ilmu menunjukkan bahwa pemaknaan terhadap habit tidak akan pernah stabil dan sangat kontekstual, serta sangat terkait dengan apa yang disebut dengan pendisiplinan dan kekuasaan. Okay, so thank you, Professor Bennett, for your explanation. I tried to capture your speech in a brief way, but I'm sure there's a lot of things that I didn't discuss, that I didn't explain to the audience. We will now move on to the question and answer session. We already have several questions here. So let me start with the first question. This is from Trinil Windrawati. And the question is, in the traditional arts, which is closely associated with habits, what strategies could be done in order to negotiate with the demand of the industrial world nowadays that might overpower or disrupt the creative habit or routines?
Gosh, that's a difficult one for me. I'm not quite clear here. It may well be that there's a specific Indonesian connection with traditional arts here. So I'm not entirely clear what is being referred to by traditional arts. Could I ask for some clarification on that?
Sure. Maybe Ibu or Bapak Trinil Windrawati would like to explain, and I can translate to Professor Bennett. If I may interpret the question, Professor Bennett, I think it refers to, in Indonesian traditional arts, for example, routines and habits, for example, how people do traditional arts like dances or maybe carving or other forms of traditional arts is highly associated with habits because people do arts through routines. But with the industrial demands, now probably there are some creative changes that needs to be done, which disrupt that particular routines and habits through so-called modernization and so on and so forth. So the question is, are there any strategies, or maybe what is your opinion on that particular issue?
I think this is a case of something that I alluded to in my talk when I said that the concept of habit has always to be considered. There are many other concepts that seem to be about the same thing, but they're not. So that when we talk about habit and repetition have a particular set of meanings when they're associated together, but these are not always the same thing as forms of repetition associated with other concepts. So I think that in the case of the traditional arts that they're being referred to here, it's probably more the concept of rituals and the forms of repetition associated with rituals that are more appropriate and more telling, or the forms of repetition indeed that are associated with the concept of tradition that are more appropriate than the forms of repetition that are associated with habit in the way that I've been speaking of it, given that the ones of habit are more ones that are, it's kind of like they're associated with things that are inscribed in the brain, in the nervous system, and so on, rather than being inscribed in particular socially accepted rituals. So it's a kind of, one can't quarantine the concept of habit so that it has nothing to do with these, but I think that the issues that are associated with ritual practices in the arts are really quite different from the ones that I've been talking about. And it's not a subject on which I know a great deal.
Thank you, Professor Bennett.
Can I say, do call me Tony?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Tony. Let me move on to the next question, which is from Ade Fajarwati. This is related to history and habit. So Ade asked that Indonesian historical traces are mostly kept in museums and also other colonial sites that most of the time are far more attracting for visitors in comparison with other local sites. Is it possible that habit during the colonial era is affecting how us in contemporary time assess or make meaning of heritage from the colonial era?
Could you, that's a very good question. Could I just ask you to give me the first part of it again, the very first sentence?
Indonesian historical traces are mostly kept in museums and also other colonial sites. But most of the time, these colonial sites are far more interesting for visitors in comparison with other local sites. So is it possible that habit during the colonial era is affecting how us in contemporary time assess or make meaning of heritage from the colonial era?
It could be, but again, I think this is probably a question that relates more to the role of culture, custom, and tradition than it does to the role of habit in the way that I've been speaking about. But I also suspect that it relates to, I hesitate to say this because I've never been to Indonesia. I'd love to, but I've never been to Indonesia, so I don't know, you know, what the heritage sites are like there. But I would be tempted to say that this refers more to the, no doubt, disputed power of particular forms of colonial knowledge and expertise as lodged within the administration of heritage sites to be able to retain a continuing presence in Indonesian life when long past the time at which the dynamics in Indonesian society have passed them or wish to pass them.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. The next question is from Erasure. The question is already in English, so let me just read it for you. So the notion of interrupting habit to alter or create new habit shows, as you mentioned, an interesting promise of agency. Yet, authorizing habit in form of interruption in contemporary period in Indonesia is deeply related to the larger structure. For example, government institutions authorize habits through programs and initiatives, such as mental revolution. So during the Jokowi president's era, there's this terminology called mental revolution, how he wants to change the mentality of Indonesian people. So in which Indonesian people are being driven to be innovative in the face of rapid technology development. How do you see this kind of development, and how do this relate to a larger globalized capitalistic structure?
Well, thank you for that question. There's, as indeed for all of the earlier questions, there's such a lot in that question. I think that there is now a very large and growing literature on the relationship between new media, new industrial technologies, the internet, new forms of industrial production and habits. It's probably the most politically pointed contemporary set of issues that one can engage with around questions of habit. I think there is the question of innovation, being driven to be innovative in the face of rapid technology. But I think that so far as the habit literature is concerned, the major focus has been less upon innovation than upon three other areas, I think. I mean, there's a massive concern with the degree to which contemporary media, contemporary forms of industrial production are producing new forms of automatism, that they are producing a greater tendency for robotic forms of labor rather than innovative ones. And one of the literatures in which these concerns are being worked through, I think, very, very interestingly, is the literature on infrastructures, the new forms of infrastructures associated with things like the new forms of shopping associated with Amazon. There's a massive literature associated with the exploitation, new forms of the routinization and exploitation of labor in new, worse than an assembly line contexts associated with new delivery systems rather than production systems. So many 19th century concerns focused on the kind of like the factory system and forms of production have been displaced towards infrastructures of delivery and their consequences for habit and repetition. There's also a massive concern with the implications of, the operation of companies like Google and FaceTime and so on, and the ways in which our habits are being subjected to new forms of management and manipulation through the ways in which they're collected by digital organizations like Google and are then able to be used to act upon us by capitalist organizations in terms of shaping our daily habits, tastes, and interests. A third strand of debate is one that relates to a point that I was making around when I referred to John Locke and his account of the significance of moments of stillness, which allow people to kind of like pull themselves out of their habits in order to be able to reflect upon them and potentially change them. Some people would argue, and the American critic whose work I really like, Jonathan Crary, argues in his book 24/7, very interestingly, that the contemporary rhythms of data life, of machinofacture, the contemporary rhythms of media life and so on, take away the capacity for that sort of like mental space. That it's all, our mental lives are preoccupied 24/7, so that capacity to be still and reflect is taken away. So I'm not sure whether I've answered the exact question that was put to me there, but the point I wanted to get across is that what the question points to is an immense set of debates about how habits pathways, if you like, are currently undergoing very significant transformations and highly contested political territory.
Thank you, Tony. So I think in relation to that question and your elaboration, I find it very interesting when you were discussing about habit and repetition, because when you say that at some point habit and repetition was particularly in relation to the Aristotle concept, how habit could be on one side a limitation, but on the other side it can also be a virtue, like leading out to a particular different ending. So I was thinking about whether you could elaborate on that, particularly in relation to what is happening now with the pandemic, as we are being situated to break down out of our everyday habits or creating so-called new normalcies, because now it's like reprogramming our mental state on how to deal with our everyday life. So would you please elaborate on that?
Well, I would. It's a very good question, and it's let me make a more general point first, and then I'll come back and answer the question. What I've talked about today has been, my title was A Political History of Habit in the singular. Okay. And as opposed to a political history of different habits, as you talked about them now, which would be all sorts of things to do with our everyday conducts, habits of, habits of social distancing or not social distancing, habits of hand washing or not hand washing, habits of working at home or not working at home, habits of traveling or not traveling, habits of assembling as crowds to protest or not. Okay, so, and I'll come back on those things in relationship to the pandemic in a moment. Now, obviously habit in the singular and habits in the plural, all right, they're connected with one another, but in terms of historical debates and theoretical debates, it's worthwhile keeping them a little bit apart, because when philosophers talk about habit, they're talking about a capacity to repeat, and through repeating, in some cases, a capacity to acquire new capacities. They're not talking about particular habits, all right? And my interest, I originally became interested in these questions through particular habits. And it's in the course of reading philosophers that I've begun to think, that's a funny way of thinking. And that I've got interested in the political history of habit in the singular. And that's what I've been talking about today. But to come to your question on habits, in the institute in which I work, the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, we had a symposium yesterday that was on this question. And I and a number of colleagues in that institute, we're currently working on a project funded by the Australian Research Council that's called Assembling and Governing Habits, in which precisely what we're looking at are the processes through which all sorts of habits of littering, of how crowds conduct, of high-rise living, how all kinds of like daily habits are constantly governed in one way and another in the societies in which we live. And in the course of, we started this project about 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, when it became clear to us, round about, like everyone else, round about April, May, that we had a pandemic on our hands and that everything was changing, we began to think about COVID-19 and its consequences for habits. And what we're seeing, what we're living through at the moment everywhere are processes through which the habits of everyday life, our project's called Assembling and Governing Habits, and we can see how habits that have governed our everyday lives up until now are being disassembled, pulled apart, broken up, and we can see how new habits are being assembled. And we can also see how, in this process, the debates about whether being governed through our habits is something that is compulsory, or what the implications are for our freedom are very much at stake. So these questions about governing habits in the plural are extremely pertinent at the moment. And obviously a key part of this has to do with some habits that were once familiar to us have become unfamiliar, and habits that were not familiar to us, like wearing face masks, for example, have become familiar. Not to mention taking part in international conferences via Zoom. So these are profoundly consequential matters in the present.
Thank you, Tony, for elaborating on that. So we have several other questions, but I noticed that some of the questions have actually been answered previously. So let me choose questions that probably could be discussed further. So there's one from Mundi Rahayu, which says that I agree the notion that habit is closely related to power relation. So what does it imply for the art and creative process in this disruptive era?
Well, I would imagine it implies, I think the issues for the creative arts and creativity in general in our current process are ones that really, in the current situation, are profoundly difficult. I mean, I don't know what the situation is in Indonesia, but I'd be surprised if it's not the same as the situation in Australia in which the arts are in dire trouble. The arts and the creative industries are in dire trouble because you can't go to live performances. The whole economic basis of the creative arts has been called into question. Now, but I think that if I understand Mundi Rahayu's question correctly, it points to, I think, the relationships between habit and the creative arts has been one that's varied at different moments in their histories. I mentioned when referring to, when discussing Catherine Malibu's work, that she was drawing on a modernist conception of the aesthetic. And it's fairly true, I think, to say, and this is not a criticism of it as a weakness, it's an important aspect of the contribution that it's made, is that the creative arts in their modernist and indeed postmodernist understanding have, in many senses, regarded themselves as a kind of a mechanism, an apparatus, a set of practices that do seek to disrupt everyday habits, that do seek to disrupt taken for granted ways of thinking, that they do seek to open up, to rupture taken for granted presuppositions so that we might think about ourselves, the societies in which we live anew. And, I think that's been that has been a very powerful, an aspect of a very powerful contribution that they make. It's summarized by Beckett once referred to habit as, what was it, a dog chained to its vomit. That's how Beckett referred to habit. And a good deal of modern aesthetics has been to do with kind of like disconnecting the dog from its vomit, if I can put it that way. So I think that for the art and the creative process in this disruptive era, it is incumbent upon political artists to keep their critical gaze turned upon the forms, turned upon the different ways in which this crisis is currently being managed, and to be critical of the least productive forms in which it's being managed in different contexts. So that critical eye of the arts is very necessary in these times.
Yes, thank you. Maybe shifting the discussion a little bit back to what you presented, particularly on your example on Aboriginals' failure. I was wondering whether you can elaborate more on that when you state that self-improving potential of habit pathways contributed to the development of biopolitical programs of colonial governance, in which strategies of racial elimination increasingly displace programs of cultural improvement. Because I think it's closely related to what the condition nowadays, particularly with what is happening, for example, in the States. Thank you.
What is happening in the States, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Let me just talk about this. Let me talk about this first in relationship to Australian history, and the Australia was colonized, as you'll all know, colonized at the end of the 18th century, and the history of the relationship between the colonizing population and indigenous peoples has gone through a number of changes, profound changes at different moments in the history. For the greater part of the 19th century until around about the late 19th century, it was held that, yes, the Aborigines were, indigenous Australians were viewed as having somehow failed to develop, that they were not, they failed to develop Western technologies and so on and so forth. But what was held out was the kind of hope that progressively, through being exposed to the influence of the colonizers' culture is that they would kind of like develop and become taken away from, that they would develop through cultural mechanisms, that they would develop, move away from their earlier history and develop. By the by the end of the 19th century, and what I mean to refer then by the development of biopolitical governments, the development of biopolitical governance for Foucault is essentially racial. And biopolitical governance has to do with the right and power to kill or not to kill. So that by the end of the 19th century, this sense that not only had the indigenous population been stuck, as it were, and had failed to develop, it was also believed that it was racially incapable of developing, that it was going to be stuck in the same grooves forever. And so what began to replace earlier civilizational strategies were strategies of racial elimination. So this was very clear and very explicit. And these strategies of racial elimination worked in a number of ways. First of all, they worked through what became markedly significant from probably around about the 1870s and 1880s on, lasting through to the late 1920s, were massacres on the racial frontier. It's often been denied that there were massacres in Australia, colonial massacres, but there were. And it's not only that, it's clear that these massacres form part of what was an explicit war waged against the Aboriginal people by the colonizers. And recent work that's been going on to enumerate the number of people killed in the massacres has hundreds of thousands. But the strategy of racial elimination also meant, in the Australian context, what came to be known as breeding out the colour. And this was a policy through which it became extremely, through what later became known as the stolen generation, through which children, particularly children who were half-castes, were taken away from their Aboriginal parents in order to be brought up by colonizers' families with a view to eventually they would be people who would become white, like everyone else in Australia, like the colonizers, whereas Indigenous Australians, what they were called full-blooded Aborigines, were to be consigned to reservations where they were to be left to die out. So the history of habit then is in complicated ways. It is tied up with, in relationship to Indigenous populations. It's not the central issue to be addressed in terms of strategies of racial elimination, but it has been tied up with those histories. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, thank you. Yes. Okay, so we've actually reached the limited time, which is 90 minutes. 90 minutes, because we're doing this via Zoom, even though we want it to be longer, but we know it's quite exhausting to do this kind of things online. But before we finish, I would like to invite Ibu Wita, who would like to say hi to Professor Tony Bennett. Ibu Wita, are you here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ibu Getty.
Oh, hi, Ifrit. Thank you. Thank you for your correspondence.
Yeah, thank you, really, thank you, Prof. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, my pleasure. All right then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you so much for.
Thank you, Prof. Tony.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Okay, so to wrap up, let me thank Professor Tony Bennett for his presentation, and also for.
Sorry, Bu Getty.
Yes.
Okay, I'd like is Prof. Tony Bennett still here? that you can be here with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so really thank you. Okay, please,
you.
Bu Getty.
The floor to the committee, and thank you everyone for participating. And we can answer all the.
Decision also marks the end of our morning session. We will have a break and see you again at 1 p.m. in the parallel session. Ladies and gentlemen, after we rest for a while, we will go straight to the next show. Thank you to presenters, all the audience, and all who have been involved for today's event. I am Fahrul Anissa Rahmah Isnaini. As the master of ceremony today, say goodbye. I apologize for any weakness I make. Hope to see you tomorrow at the second day of the conference, November 6, 2020. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Setiap hari kita dihadapkan dengan pilihan. Karena tanpa disadari, teknologi telah mengubah tiap momen kehidupan. Pertukaran informasi tidak lagi mengenal jarak dan waktu. Derasnya arus informasi mendorong kita untuk cerdas dalam memilah bacaan. Untuk itu, Harian Kompas senantiasa berinovasi hadirkan kompas.id. Dilengkapi menu dan fitur pilihan, kompas.id lebih dari sekadar sajian informasi berkualitas secara daring, tetapi juga memberikan pengalaman baru dalam membaca berita. Menyajikan informasi berdasarkan fakta dan data akurat sebagai referensi terpercaya, kompas.id berikan kemudahan dalam menikmati sajian berita terkini, menemani dalam kebersamaan untuk ciptakan gagasan kreatif. Harian Kompas. Bergerak bersama, hasilkan karya terbaik bagi negeri.
Iya ya.
Ya, hampir salah. Handphone dibawa.
Aduh, mama ke mencet iya ya. Selesai.
Cek.
Tes tes 1 2 3. Tes tes. Tes tes 1 2 3. Percobaan. Halo. Tes tes 1 2 3. 1 2 3 percobaan. Tes tes 1 2 3 percobaan. Gatot kaca adalah putra Bima. Jadi epos Mahabharata. Jumpa lagi bersama gue aja.
Cek. Cek. Cek 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 1 2 3 cek. Cek 1 2 3 cek 1 2 3 tes mic buat video gue.
Hmm.